What are fair expectations for the Jets in 2022? Who should go to the bench when Garrett Wilson comes on the field? And yes, I'm already getting questions about whether Robert Saleh is on the hot seat. It's a Mailbag Wednesday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. It is Wednesday, September 14th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you for making this show your first listen or first watch every day. This show's free, and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. Big shout out to subscribers to this podcast, and to join that group, all you have to do is hit the subscribe button wherever you're watching or listening. You'll never miss an episode. You'll get notifications as new episodes are posted. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give it a thumbs up. Helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Our episode today is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. Well, today we have our weekly mailbag. Each week we try and do a mailbag show. We actually missed last week because it was opening week and I had to accommodate Mr. Eagle's schedule, but we are back this week with our Wednesday mailbag show. Thank you so much to everybody who sent in questions, and we will begin with a question from a listener named Cameron. Cameron asks, "Hey John, first I'd like to say that I love the Jets podcast. Your prior two podcasts were about tempering expectations, and I cannot agree more. I'm not sure anyone would have picked the Jets to win that game prior to it happening, although it was uglier than expected. With that said, I have the Jets going 7-10 this year with wins against the Bears, Lions, Jaguars, and Seahawks. I also have them splitting with the Patriots and Dolphins and grabbing their first win week 4 in a hard-fought battle against Pittsburgh, regardless of whether Wilson is back. Can you put in stone what you think the record this year should be, and maybe give a weekly update as to whether the team is meeting, exceeding, or falling short of expectations? This will help a lot of us calm down." So I guess the question is, what are my expectations for this year? And I think Cameron's right. I think 7-10 is kind of where I have my head right now. Now, a lot of it depends on whether Zach Wilson can get back and hopefully play effective football. But I think the Jets are at a point where you can't really excuse a bad season. Listen, you had high expectations for Joe Douglas. I had high expectations. Or maybe we were willing to give Joe Douglas a chance. But at some point, there need to be results here. At some point, the word rebuilding needs to focus on the building part. And that's the most important part of rebuilding. It's actually building the team. It's the part that where so many Jets general managers have failed in recent years. The Jets have attempted this a lot. It hasn't really worked out. But here's why it's so important. They spent $88 million guaranteed in free agency this year. They just drafted 4 players in the top 40. A year ago, they drafted 3 players in the top 40. There's not going to be a lot of money to spend this offseason. Now, when I say that, people say, oh, well, there's going to be chances to improve. There are going to be chances to improve, but they're not going to be able to overhaul the roster again. When you spend the amount of money that the Jets spent this offseason in free agency, you pretty much tie up your roster for 2 years. Yeah, of course there's going to be cap space. All 32 teams have cap space, but the Jets are not going to be among the league leaders in cap space. And beyond that, they got some players that they either need to re-sign or replace, including 40% of the offensive line, because George Fant's a free agent after the season, and Connor McGovern's a free agent after the season. So those are 2 guys who are going to eat up, either re-signing them or replacing them is going to eat up a decent chunk of cap space, or you're going to have to use one of your early draft picks to replace them. So you can't just look at this and say, oh, well, another 4-win season's fine, we're building. Well, no, because you don't have a lot of cap space. And not only that, now listen, you're not going to be short on draft picks, but the days of the Seattle picks are over. You're not going to have 2 first-round picks this year. The Jamal Adams compensation is now completed. So the Jets can't look forward to having all this extra draft capital to build their team. The resources that they had to spend have been spent over the last 2 years. This is the shot Joe Douglas had. You do not get an infinite amount of time to build up your team. Now, why do I say 7 wins is the expectation rather than the playoffs? Well, because a lot of the core players on this team are first and second year players. So you want to give them time to develop. They should be good enough, along with all the other players the Jets added, to get you to 7 wins. And, I'm not really big on picking the schedule because, first of all, you don't know how teams are going to look by the end of the year. Every year the playoffs turnover about half the teams in the playoffs are new. So there's always a lot of turnover in the NFL. And a lot of it comes down to luck. A lot of it comes down to injuries. I mean, a team could be decimated by injuries that would otherwise be good. So it's difficult to say, but you feel like the talent level on this team, at least where the talent level should be, when you're factoring in and giving them the break that they're young players, I think it's got to be 7. Maybe you could sell me on 6, but I think it's got to be up there. I mean, you can't go 4-13 again, and then after everything you have just put into this roster, after all the resources you just spent, there has to be tangible improvement. And then next year, I think we can't make excuses anymore. Next year has to be a team that's right there in the playoff race. This year, I'd like to see the Jets, enter December in the playoff race, which is not that hard, not that much to ask. Last year, there were 26 teams at the beginning of December. So 26 out of 32 were either in playoff position or one game out of the playoffs. Only the bottom 6 teams in the league, which the Jets were one of, were out of the playoff race entering December. So, you talk about playing meaningful games in December. That was actually a phrase I think Joe Douglas used a few months ago. And you think, well, that's a lot to... It's not a lot to ask. You're asking the Jets to not be one of the worst teams in the NFL this year after they spent a ton in free agency and have had these 2 huge draft classes. That's not a lot to ask. Cameron mentioned the game over the weekend, how it was a disappointing result. And it was a disappointing result. There's no question about it. But I mentioned this yesterday. I mentioned it the day before. I don't think it was a case where the Jets were totally overmatched. I think that it was a case where there were just a couple of plays that let the game get away from the Jets. Now, that's one game. I just spent yesterday talking about not overreacting to one game. If the Jets go out and get blown out by a Cleveland team that, did not look spectacular week 1, maybe they got the result they wanted, but they did not look spectacular. A team playing with Jacoby Brissett as quarterback. If the Jets don't play competitively this week and they fall to 0-2, this could get a little ugly. But I think for me, the number is 7 wins. That's where I'd say 7 wins and playing meaningful games in December. Because if you're not playing meaningful games in December, and I look back, and the reason I say that is I think back to 2019, where technically the Jets got 7 wins, but they were never in the playoff race. The season was over in like September or maybe early October. It was over by that point. So you couldn't really say that was a season where the Jets were competitive. So 7 wins and in the mix, in having an actual shot at the playoffs in December. And if you get there, who knows what happens? Every year there's one team that gets hot at the end of the season. And it just, it works out. Maybe the Jets will be the team that gets hot in December. But you got to be in the mix to be the team that can take advantage of getting hot. Our next question, also from Cameron. Call it an overreaction, but Joe Douglas seems to have nailed the draft this year. I know it's only one game, but everyone looks to be keepers so far. So how is it that he seems to be so completely clueless when it comes to grabbing quarterbacks and kickers? I'm still on the hill that Zach will bounce back this year, but there's an extremely real chance he simply is not an NFL caliber quarterback. Add to this the complete inability to get a backup in there, especially after losing Zach for a number of weeks last year. I'm not sure Joe knows what an NFL quarterback looks like. All these criticisms apply to the kickers he grabs as well. My question is, can you think of any GM who completely whiffs on quarterback pickups but keeps their job because they nailed the rest of the positions? And what are the odds? This is what we're watching unfold with Joe. Well, listen, I think that if Zach Wilson fails, there might be a scenario where Joe Douglas has done a good enough job to survive, but it's unlikely. I mean, most of the time the GM's tied to the quarterback. But I'll give you one example. It's the guy he learned from, the guy he grew up under, and that's Ozzie Newsome. The Ravens had a horrible time getting quarterbacks to their team in the early 2000s. Everybody talks about that Super Bowl team in 2000, the dominant defense. What everybody forgets is they wasted like 6-7 years of dominant defenses because they could never figure out the quarterback position. They signed Elvis Gerbach after the Super Bowl season, who was a complete free agent bust. They drafted Kyle Bowler a few years later, who was a total bust as a first-round pick. In fact, in 2007, everybody forgets this, Brady Quinn fell in the draft. Baltimore tried to trade up for him. If they do that, they do not get Joe Flacco. And I know, Joe Flacco is kind of a difficult topic to talk about, but Joe Flacco in his Baltimore days was a good quarterback, and they don't win the Super Bowl if they replace Joe Flacco with Brady Quinn. Now, eventually they did figure out the quarterback position. Listen, the quarterback position is tough. It's really, look at the bust rate of quarterbacks in the first round in the NFL. It's not that easy to find. So, I don't know you could say at this point, especially when we don't know how Zach's going to turn out. Zach could end up being pretty good. So we can't really say Joe Douglas doesn't know how to draft quarterbacks yet. When it comes to kickers, I mean, the issue is pretty obvious, I think. Joe Douglas values leg strength over accuracy. And the other issue is, I actually would differentiate Greg Zuerlein a little bit from the other kickers, because in past years, part of the problem is that they've gone with these big leg kickers who have no track record of kicking in the NFL. Zuerlein's a little different. Maybe it was just a bad week, or maybe it's because career's over and the Jets need to dump. But this is a little different, I think, than Matt Amendola or all these other guys they brought in. Of course, last year they finally found a kicker who was good, Eddie Pinheiro, but we couldn't keep Eddie. But I think Zuerlein's a little bit different. If the Jets are bringing in kickers who actually have a track record of success in this league, then I can't get as upset with them as I've been in recent years, because they're at least bringing in, any kicker can have a bad year, and this is the thing people don't get. GMs always get criticized when their kicker stinks, but kickers are very up and down in this league. There's not really a lot outside of Justin Tucker. There's not a lot of consistency from year to year at the kicker position. So I think it's something to keep in mind. It's not that easy. It's another spot that's not that easy to fill, because kickers just really don't. A guy could be great this year, bad next year. And that's Jason Myers. Jason Myers, second year in Seattle, never missed a kick. Last year, he was worse than the Jets kickers. All these people were complaining about Jason Myers last year. I was like, did you follow what Jason Myers did in 2021? He was worse than all the kickers the Jets had. So it's just not that easy to do. Now, I think Joe Douglas's performance when it comes to the backup quarterback position and the kicker spot, they have not been good, and they're very difficult to defend to date. But if we're talking starting quarterback, it's a little different. And this year, I think the kicking spot, there's a little difference, because he brought in a guy in Greg Zuerlein who actually has a track record. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll continue this weekly mailbag. It only took 1 week. I got a question about whether Robert Saleh is going to get fired, whether he's on the hot seat. I'll give you my thoughts as we continue this Wednesday mailbag episode of Locked On Jets. As I mentioned, we're going to be talking about whether Robert Saleh is going to be looking for a new job. We're going to be talking about whether the Jets will be looking for a new coach. Well, if the Jets do end up looking for a new coach, they'll probably not have that difficult of a time finding candidates. It's an NFL head coaching job, but your small business might be a little different. And as you gear up this fall, you need the right people on your team to help your small business fire on all cylinders. That's what LinkedIn Jobs is here to do. They're here to make it easier to find the people you want to talk to faster and for free. You can create a free jobs post in minutes on LinkedIn Jobs to reach your network and beyond to the world's largest professional network of over 810 million people. Then you add your job in the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring, so your network can help you find the right people to hire. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience, so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. That's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates you want to talk to faster. Did you know every week nearly 40 million job seekers visit LinkedIn? Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. The show's free, and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. Our next question: Flacco looks bad. If Saleh starts him again and he stinks again, do you think that greatly increases the chances he gets fired? Does Joe Douglas get fired? I can't say with 100% certainty nobody's getting fired, but I don't think either of them are on the hot seat today. Now, in the NFL, you're always one disaster season away from getting fired. Entering the 2020 season, the Jets were going to keep Adam Gase unless he gave them no choice, unless the season was so bad that they just had to move on. As we all know, that's what happened. So you enter the season, and sometimes people say there's no way the guy's getting fired. There's always a way. But I think it would take a disaster season. I think we're talking like 3-14. I think we're talking maybe 4-13. That's the type of season where people get fired. But the thing about this is, I go back to what I said in the first segment. There's not a lot of maneuverability this offseason for the Jets. So if you get rid of Saleh, or even if you get rid of Joe Douglas, next year's kind of a waste anyway. So unless you feel the need, you absolutely have to make the change. This was almost a 2-year thing where they're just going to see whether this core that they've put together can work over a 2-year period. So next year things probably would not be that different anyway. So I almost would, and we'll see how I feel near the end of the season. I think that this is like an there's going to be a weekly question when the Jets lose a game. What are the odds these people are getting fired? But I feel like you almost bring him back just to give him another shot to make it work, because anybody else you bring in is going to be dealing with essentially the same roster. Now, again, new draft. Everybody gets the draft, so, you could always hit a Grand Slam draft, or maybe you find some really good under-the-radar free agents. It does happen, but I don't think you can count on this team being drastically different next year than the way it looks this year. So I don't think they're going to get fired. I'd be surprised if it happened. And I think even if they do have that kind of disaster season, there's still a chance they're back. But I'm not going to say that it's 100% guaranteed that these guys are going to come back, because it's never a 100% guarantee in the NFL. And sometimes, if people get unhappy enough, and Robert Saleh, for his part, I think one thing he's proven, he's not great with the media. And it reminds me a little bit of Todd Bowles in the past, where Bowles was not great with the media. And it's tricky because being bad with the media doesn't really impact your team on the field. I don't think you win or lose more games because you're good or bad with the media. But I think when you're losing, if you're bad with the media, because that's really the way you communicate with the fans, I think it means the fans give you less slack. They give you less leeway, and they're less patient with you, and they're more willing to see you go. So I think that's the danger for Saleh, is that the way he's handled the media, and it's kind of escalated this week when he made this comment, I'm keeping the receipts on the people who doubted us. That's not really what fans want to hear when your team's 0-1, and when you went 4-13 last year. I think his handling of the media puts him probably in a little bit greater danger, but I still think he's probably back next year, unless it's just a catastrophe. Our next question: you have stated you think the offensive line will need time to gel and improve, which I agree with. But if offensive lines need time together, why do we see a lack of reps in training camp and preseason consistently? I get there's an injury risk, but wouldn't you rather work out your issues prior to the regular season than the first few weeks? Well, I think you answered the question. It's because coaches are afraid of injuries. And I think not only are they afraid of injuries, I think on some level, maybe they're a little afraid of getting criticized, because whenever a player gets hurt in preseason, everybody goes crazy and everybody says, why did the coach do that? After Zach Wilson got injured in that game against Philadelphia, I did a couple of podcast interviews. People wanted my perspective on the Jets. And one question I got a couple times was, well, should Zach Wilson have been in the game? Should Saleh have risked him? And I said, it's the catch-22, because you get to week one and the offense doesn't look very crisp. Then everybody's saying, well, why didn't you play more in preseason? But if people get hurt, then you say then they'll say, why did you play this guy in a meaningless game? And I go back, even back to 2019. The Jets played a preseason game in Atlanta where starting linebacker Avery Williamson got hurt, and Adam Gase got criticized heavily for it. And listen, if you're a longtime listener of this podcast, or actually, if you're not a longtime listener of this podcast, let me tell you something. I was not one to make excuses for Adam Gase. I was not one to say many kind things about Adam Gase. When Adam Gase did something wrong, I was pretty quick to point it out. But I did not. That was one of the few things I did not think was ever fair to Gase, was when he was criticized for Avery Williamson getting injured. I think it really, though, the reason teams do it is they're afraid of injury, and I think coaches are maybe a little afraid of getting criticized when a player gets injured. I think it's really that simple. Would teams be better advised to play their starters out there? To be honest with you, I kind of think they would, because you watch these week one games, players are all really tired in the second half, and there is no cohesion. You mentioned it. I actually kind of feel like teams maybe, and the other aspect of this is training camp. No more 2-a-days in training camps like there were 20 years ago or so, where teams were practicing in the morning and in the afternoon. They had 2 practices a day, if you can believe that. That went away back in 2011. And there's not as much contact as there used to be in practice. So you can't really even simulate the game reps in these training camp practices. So I think that's something else to consider. But I don't think it's going to change. I think teams are just afraid of players getting hurt. And you'll just have to deal with chemistry issues the first couple weeks of the season. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk about a rookie. We're going to talk Garrett Wilson. And when he's on the field, which wide receiver should sit in his place. Well, that's as we continue this Wednesday mailbag. Ahead here on Locked On Jets, we'll talk about Garrett Wilson. Got his career off to an impressive start on Sunday. He's not a full-time player yet, though, so I may not play him if I was a daily fantasy player. But I would go to PrizePicks, however. Here's how it works. You pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry. There's no competing against other players. It's you versus the projections available. PrizePicks offers projections on any sport you want. That includes the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, the NHL, PGA, college football, men's college basketball, women's college basketball, soccer, WNBA, esports, NASCAR, tennis, MMA, boxing, Euro basketball, cricket. I feel like I'm forgetting one. But anyway, entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's that easy. Safe and fast withdrawals, and it's currently operational in over 30 states and Canada. Download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. And you can play all the sports I mentioned, or I was just joking. I did not forget my favorite, disc golf. You can play daily fantasy disc golf. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. Don't forget to enter that promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match of up to $100 at PrizePicks. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Wednesday mailbag show. Our next question, Garrett Wilson has got to be on the field. Who comes off then? I say Davis, too many drops. I would roll with Moore, Berrios, and Wilson. I think Berrios is the guy who comes off the field. Berrios is a backup receiver. He's a backup receiver, and he's a good return guy. He's a pretty good backup receiver, but he's a backup. Corey Davis, I feel like people are too hard on Corey Davis, and I think expectations were not really fair for Corey Davis last season. Now, for his part, Corey Davis did not have a great season, and the injury obviously kind of derailed things near the end, and even before that, he was very inconsistent. But Corey Davis is a competent starting receiver in this league, and in 9 games last year, he had more receiving yards than Berrios had in 16. And nothing against Berrios. He's a fine part-time player. Again, he was first-team All-Pro as a return guy, but he's a backup. The problem, I think, is when the Jets signed Corey Davis, people were expecting a number 1 receiver. But the thing is, he did not get number 1 receiver money. And the Jets drafted these 2 young guys. I think they really want Elijah Moore and Garrett Wilson to develop into high-end receivers. I think Corey Davis is more of a complementary player. And if Wilson and Moore develop, then Corey Davis is going to look a lot better. Davis may not be back next year, but I feel like people are too hard on it. What happens with Corey Davis is everybody goes crazy when he doesn't produce, but when he does make plays, people just don't say anything. I mean, that game Sunday was a perfect example. Corey Davis, I thought, played pretty well, but everybody's focused on the 1 drop he had. Outside of that, I mean, I think he looked pretty good. And it was a game where there were probably like 5, if not drops, 5 times guys did not come up with catches they should have had on both sides because it was a bad weather game. So I just feel like people are too hard on Corey Davis. I think he's a competent receiver. I don't think he's great. I think he's a supporting player, maybe a second or third option on a good passing offense, but I think he's a competent NFL player. And our next question, John, in honor of Overreaction Week, would the Jets have won on Sunday with Geno Smith at quarterback? Hey, Geno won on Monday night. How about that? You got off to an amazing start in that game if you watched it. Look, that was fun. I have to be honest, that was fun. Good for Geno. I got to be honest, back in 2014, I thought he was going to be out of the league in 2 years because he was having such a rough time with the Jets. In fact, he's still in the league in 2022 and starting games and getting a win. That's great for Geno. I think we all know that this is not going to last forever. In fact, it really kind of ended last night. That first half, he was great. The second half, he threw for 31 yards. So you see Geno's a limited guy. If his first read's there, the ball's going to be on the money. And there's a lot of quarterbacks you can't say that about. That was not true of Christian Hackenberg. His first read was there. He would have no idea. He wouldn't even know it was his first read. Same was true of Bryce Petty. That's why Geno's still in the league. And he's even in his 30s, Geno's got enough mobility. He can keep plays alive. He can make big plays down the field in the passing game, keeping his eyes down the field. He can even throw in a run or two. Geno's got some ability to him. Geno can do some things. Is Geno going to be a great starting quarterback, though, for 18 weeks? I don't think so. And I think you already started to see things kind of fall apart for him last night in that second half. There were some rough moments in the pocket, which has always been an issue with Geno. He brings some things to the table, though. And listen, after everything that's happened, it's been a really interesting ride for Geno. I thought it was really cool to see him have that success. Now, if he was playing for the Jets, they may have. I mean, listen, I'd take Geno over Flacco right now. I'd take Geno over Flacco in a second. So, if the Seahawks want to trade Geno for Flacco, let's do it. Jets may have won that game. Because if the Jets got to play Geno Smith gave Seattle on Monday, they very well might have won that game. I think if the Jets get competent quarterback play, they would have had a good shot to beat Baltimore. And if they get a good competent quarterback play this week against Cleveland, they'll have a really good shot at beating the Browns. I don't know if they can get it from Flacco, though. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. Big shout out once again to subscribers to the podcast. To join that group, all you have to do is hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening. You'll receive notifications as new episodes are posted. You'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please a 5-star review. Watching on YouTube, please big thumbs up. Both of these help the channel out, and they help other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.